Well, first I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me here to Berlin. Beautiful day here. It's nice to be up in the sky lobby, seeing the sun after 3 days downstairs. It's very nice to be part of the INET conference. The discussion's been fascinating, and I'm honored to be part of it. I'll start similarly to Giancarlo, who does the effectiveness of fiscal policy depend on economic context? Obviously, the answer is yes. The interesting question is how. So I'm going to talk about 3 dimensions of context. There'll be some linkages to what Giancarlo just said, and then I'll broaden things out a little bit. First off, economic slack in the broad sense. Is the economy close to full employment or not? Import leakages and international debt, and the issue of the legacy of outstanding debt. That is, would we be less likely to want to stimulate when debt is high as opposed to when debt is low? I will give a qualification here. I'm a US-centric guy. I apologize for that. So my perspective here will be very much on the United States. I think the results broadly generalize to a country that issues its own currency. But the currency zone issues that were the discussion of lots of back and forth yesterday are somewhat beyond my scope, although I might say a brief thing about it at the very end. Okay, so let me start with idle resources. Pretty obvious point. If we have fiscal expansion and the economy is close to resource constraints, close to full employment, then what will we expect? Interest rates to rise, choking off the excess demand, crowding out of private consumption and investment. But if there's substantial slack in the economy, fiscal expansion will raise sales, raise production, raise income, create new saving, so there should be no upward pressure on interest rates. I here differ a little bit from some of the literature in this, that I don't think that this result requires the zero bound. I think this requires slack resources. You could argue that if we're not at the zero bound, and you're thinking of this from a policy point of view, that you might prefer monetary policy to fiscal policy. That's a somewhat different debate. I have some concerns about that, but I do want to emphasize that it's not that fiscal policy is only effective when we're at the zero bound. It's effective when we're away from the full utilization of resources. At least that's my view. Now, I want to talk a little bit about evidence for this pretty straightforward implication. Giancarlo talked about some of the large literature that tests for the effects of fiscal policy. And my reading of it's a little bit different. One is that Valerie Ramey had a survey recently in the Journal of Economic Literature and said, well, the numbers are all over the place. You can get multipliers anywhere from 0 or even slightly negative up to about 4. But she said the kind of middle of the road number would be a number like 1.5, somewhat larger than Giancarlo's perception or characterization of that literature. Giancarlo himself, of course, explores this issue. He's just talked about it. So I want to talk about a new paper, a paper that's been supported generously by INET, along with my time series competent co-authors, and so that tells you the questions I will and will not be able to handle about this work. But James Morley and our student Irina Panovska and I have gotten together to estimate what we call a threshold structural vector autoregression model. There's 2 regimes, one with high capacity utilization, one with low capacity utilization, and the data determine which regime that the economy is in at any point in time, and we estimate multipliers that could be different if the data wanted them to be different across these 2 regimes. And what do we find? Here is the one result of many. There are lots of subtleties to this, but the simple answer is fiscal policy effect does depend on context. So in what you'll be looking at is the left graph. You see the impulse response function in the low utilization regime, and the estimated multiplier is about 1.8. Let me be clear about what this is. This is the cumulative increase in output from a one-time increase in government spending. So over time, this is how it adds up. And then, so by the time you get out to about 14, 15 quarters, basically you're back to some kind of a steady state. But the multiplier is about 1.8. In the high utilization regime, things look very different. You see, actually, while there's still a small positive effect on output initially, it actually drops off, although within the confidence region. And then we do get a positive long-run effect, but that comes to be, actually, it's about 0.6. The labeling here is a little bit misleading, the way that those numbers go. Those numbers apply to the tick mark that's right above them. So roughly 3 times the effect in the low capacity utilization regime than in the high capacity utilization. So it supports this basic implication of a simple Keynesian way of looking at the world. Now, let me comment about another interesting result here, which is a little more subtle. what is actually normal in this context? Well, as I said, the data determine the regime for each observation. Giancarlo mentioned the interesting work by Alan Auerbach and Gorodnichenko, who do something similar, but they say, well, we're going to look at recessions, which is 20% of the time, and everything else. We actually let this be determined endogenously. We'll pick the estimation routine will pick the threshold where the regime shifts. And as it turns out, about 60% of the observations, and I believe we start sometime in the 1960s with the data set, fall in the low utilization regime. Most of the observations fall in the low utilization regime. Almost all the observations since the late 1990s fall in the low utilization regime. The data tell us that most of the time, especially recently, fiscal policy has large effects. We're away from full employment. I mentioned another piece of work funded by INET, some immodest advertising here, where I'm working on more of a Keynesian growth model that actually has this context where you do occasionally get to full employment, but most of the time the economy is constrained by demand. Also, I want to mention, and we've had some discussion of financial crisis here, that these results could understate the importance of fiscal policy in severe crises because they're estimated from a period when we had reasonably effective containment. So we've, in some sense, censored the sample. We don't know what things would look like if there was no fiscal policy. You could think of this as being estimated in the context when fiscal policy and other containment mechanisms have been reasonably effective. So let me comment a little bit on something that I think we'll spill over to something that Tiff will talk about in the next presentation, the Keynesian demand channel. So there is this, as the description of this session says, the heated debate about the importance of demand shocks. And the Great Recession can be a laboratory, and Atif's work with Sufi is really very interesting on this context, in this context. But I think our results are complementary because it's clear that this asymmetry, if you like, or this nonlinearity, another way of putting it, this fact that sometimes we get bigger effects of bigger multipliers and sometimes we get smaller multipliers, is an implication of a simple Keynesian demand channel, a simple Keynesian view of the world. It does not seem to me to be an implication of the alternatives thrown out there. There are new classical stories about wealth effects or intertemporal substitution that would suggest you might get a positive multiplier for various reasons, but they would not, in my view, predict this nonlinearity or this difference, whereas this is a straightforward and obvious prediction of the Keynesian demand channel, and so I think it pushes our understanding forward not just about the policy issue, but about the deeper debates in macroeconomics. Let me talk about, with a little bit less time, on these two other contexts. First, the open economy context. And why would we worry about this? Why would we worry about the fact that that stimulus may not work as well in an open economy? Well, Giancarlo talked about this some. Let me mention a couple of simple ideas. The import leakages would reduce the so-called bang for the buck. We'd basically reduce the multiplier because some of the stimulus goes abroad. My quick response to that is at least the estimates I'm talking about and the estimates most other people are doing in this literature are done in that context. They already have these leakages there, and we get what we get. So I think the point is right, but it seems like there's still substantial stimulus. Another worry is that the debt service transfers would go abroad, and I think this is the more typical worry. Well, we'll be paying off the Chinese in the American context, and this could also lead into a possible reduction of political power. I want to take on that middle one, the debt service transfers abroad, a little bit more, and I think the key question here is this. Would we forego fiscal stimulus because of these open economy considerations that we'd otherwise pursue if the economy were closed? And I think the answer to that is very likely no. So let me just do some very simple calculations here, which I think are powerful. It's extraordinarily simple, but still I think worth thinking about. So the first point here is a little bit of an aside, but we all know about this. I tried to get a little bit of a bracket at the quantitative results on this point. So if we have $1 of stimulus, how much debt do we actually create? Well, if fiscal policy is effective at stimulating the economy and creating income, it's also going to create tax revenue. So the effect is not going to be dollar for dollar in the kinds of in the world that's consistent with the results I'm finding. So I didn't do anything very sophisticated. I just looked at the last 3 expansions in the U.S., trough to peak, looked at the change in tax revenue, total, including state and local in the U.S., over the change in GDP, averaged over the last 3 expansions, and I was surprised. The number is very high. 37 cents on for each dollar increase in GDP, tax revenue going up by 37 cents. It's bigger than I thought, although when you start to think about this includes federal taxes. I actually saw Obama's tax rate's 20%. I checked mine, it's 19%, so I'm doing a little better than Barack. That's the federal, but then you have Social Security and Medicare, and you have state and local, and you have sales tax. So maybe it's not so surprising. So how much new revenue? Well, if $1 of fiscal stimulus generates $1.80 of new income, which generates for each $1.80, 37% of that goes off to taxes. Well, that's the number. I don't have to talk so much about this. Everybody can see this, the arithmetic up there. That gives you 67 cents back in new tax revenue. So $1 of fiscal stimulus raises the deficit by 33 cents with these numbers. Now, you can bracket this, but the bottom line is that you're not going to get a very big effect of $1 of stimulus on the deficit in the first case, and much less on the foreign deficit. So roughly speaking, about half of the U.S. debt is held, debt held by the public is held outside the borders of the United States. So I did this quick benefit-cost ratio of $1.80 back. Well, I guess it'd be 16.5 cents of foreign debt. If you just consider that a complete deadweight loss, even though it is a transfer, the benefit-cost ratio is huge. Now, the U.S. case here, I think, is clear that we wouldn't worry too much about this in this context. Other countries are going to have, you'd have to do this country by country. It's going to depend on the institutional structure. It's going to depend on the openness. So this is a little harder to generalize than some of the other things I've been talking about. So let me finish with this debt overhang context, the idea of would we pursue stimulus if we had a low debt to GDP ratio, but we somehow can't afford it if we have a high ratio. I think what was the issue yesterday? We're out of ammunition kind of argument, that somehow we may not be able to stimulate the economy in this context. Well, again, why would we worry about this? And I think the basic notion is we have too much debt service, or that's what people would worry about. I'll actually come back to this in just a second, but point out here that debt service is a transfer, not a net social cost, and I think that is important. But it will be redistributive in general, and that could matter. And one could certainly imagine infeasible transfers, a huge part of GDP from taxpayers to bondholders. Obviously, I'm a fiscal dove. If sometimes people say, how can you say this? And, you know, would it be possible to have a debt to GDP ratio that's unsustainable? Well, of course, it would be true. If you had a debt to GDP ratio of 1,000, it would be a disaster. But you know, in some respects, that's not really the relevant question. The relevant question, at least, especially in the U.S. context, but here I do think this generalizes to Europe and Japan and other countries, is how relevant is this fear that somehow we'd have unsustainable transfers as the result of the so-called debt overhang. So let me again use the modern US as an example. So to estimate how big these factors really are, what do we need to know? How expensive it is to service the debt. So I've looked at the yield on TIPS, the Treasury Inflation Protected Securities, which gives us a direct measure of the market's perception of the real interest rate. And I've averaged these from the beginning of the data I could get in 2003 through 2007, in other words, before the crisis. I want to be a little conservative. Since the crisis, we have negative numbers. But before the crisis, what did they look like? The 10-year was about 2.1%, the 5-year about 1.6%. So how could we use this, again, in very simple calculations to get a sense of the legacy of the debt built up during the Great Recession? And the Great Recession is relevant in this context. This is the most significant crisis in several generations, at least so we hope. And there's been much consternation and concern about the build of debt during this period. Well, look at the U.S. data. The debt to GDP ratio, debt held by the private sector, by the public, is up about 30 percentage points. Let me assume another 15 percentage points in the next few years as we still work our way out of this crisis. If you put an average real debt service cost of 1.5% on that, I'm going to argue that's conservative, and there's two reasons. One is because the actual interest rate's much lower than those averages before the crisis, and the maturity is also lower, and much of it's short-term paying, much lower rates in fact. But it doesn't change much if you, say, put this number up into something like the 10-year number, which is closer to 2%. So again, you see my simple calculation there. If we have a 45-point rise in the debt to GDP ratio at a 1.5% interest rate, we're talking about less than 1% of GDP. Again, you like a 2% interest rate better, then you've got still less than 1% of GDP, just a little bigger than that. Now, that's not completely trivial. If you're concerned about the distributional effects of these transfers, then you might say this would be unfortunate. If we could have got, or if someday this went away and the government did not have this obligation, so much the better. But if you go back to the kind of multiplier results that I've been talking about, that Giancarlo will talk about, the kind of results that onTIPS is finding, and say that actually we can get substantial social benefits from this fiscal stimulus, this kind of cost is far from justifying the hyperbolic political rhetoric. And like I say, the assumptions here are rough, but you could change these numbers substantially and you wouldn't substantially change the conclusion. So a few perspectives. The counter-cyclical fiscal actions, actually, let me come back to this. I see Bill Janeway in the audience, and this is relevant to what he was saying, that if you just take this straight up, you're saying we're assuming the path of the economy in the long run is the same under all these situations. That's almost certainly not true. Just think about the kind of counter-cyclical fiscal actions we've had. If you take that the entire deficit, both the automatic stabilizers and the discretionary fiscal stimulus that the U.S. has pursued over the last few years, the extent to which that did provide a floor under the economy. If you think about the spillovers of that from business fixed investment, the spillovers to R&D, the spillovers to cash flow and investment, which has been a big theme of my research over the years, it's easily possible. In fact, I think it's almost likely that this would have prevented at least a 0.7% per year decline in the potential GDP level. I don't think you really need that to make the argument, but it seems that the actual net social cost could be smaller. Secondly, I wanted to mention this point that I just briefly touched on earlier, that this debt service is a transfer. It's not a net social cost. If the big concern you hear is something about if we have the debt today, that's going to imply higher taxes in the future. We're putting the burden on our children and our grandchildren in the future. I've looked a little bit at this. If the tax increase were actually an income tax increase, you're probably talking about a transfer within at least the top 20%, if not higher, in the income distribution. They pay most of the income taxes. They hold most of the bonds. You could adjust this for the bond flows or the numbers that are flowing abroad, but it's basically a redistribution among the wealthy. I think it's a bigger problem if this debt ratio is used to compromise the social safety net. That, of course, is a serious political problem, but to my mind, this is a political problem, not an economic problem. I think according to the perspective that I'm talking about here, there's no reason to think that even a big increase in debt like we've seen in the US in the last several years isn't manageable basically within the institutional structure that we have. So this is my final slide. I don't want to give the suggestion that I'm a complete fiscal dove. I do actually think there's a point of long-run fiscal balance. Yes, debt ratios can become unsustainable. If you run out models where if you're at full employment and running a large deficit, you'll get unpleasant asymptotic results. So that's pretty clear. I think a good example of this is the debate that Amartya Sen talked a little bit about US healthcare costs. We have to deal with that issue. In the long run, at full employment, in my view, we should have a tax system that can support the US healthcare system going forward. And so the point here is to avoid high borrowing at full employment, to avoid the classical higher interest rates and crowding out. But the actual magnitude of debt accumulation due to cyclical factors from the calculations I've been sharing with you here strikes me as not a big problem. In other words, I'm arguing the costs are really very, very low, and if you go back to the multiplier effects, the benefits can be quite large. So in that sense, austerity is a mistake in a weak sovereign currency economy. What I mean by weak is one that's far away from full employment or potential output. And that's true even if there is substantial outstanding debt, foreign or domestic. And I guess my last point then will be the one that's not on the slide, to generalize a bit to the Eurozone. Obviously the sovereign currency risk changes the story substantially, country by country, but it would seem, what I'd like to see is that this debate does take into account that the Eurozone as a whole is very much like the economy that I'm looking at here, and that this in some ways should be the guiding factor. I realize politically that's rather a naive statement to say, but that the debt ratios here in Europe are not substantially different. They differ from some countries to another. I guess Greece is a bit of an exception, but Spain is fine. Italy is a bit high, but not dramatically higher. If Italy were paying interest rates in the range of the US or the Germans, they wouldn't have a problem at all. In fact, I believe they're running a primary surplus. So in my view, it would be much better if this debate about how do we deal with the political distributional issues within Europe were conditioned by these more aggregate results. The debate would be a better one. So let me stop here, and happy to get your comments later. Thank you.